All right, welcome. My name's Rick Jury. I'm a senior SRE at Xero, and today I'm going to be talking about how to make your log volume manageable again with policy and automation. And later in my talk as well, we'll have Pratik from Sumo who's going to talk about the business value realization
Yes. Thank you.
service as well. Yeah, so I think you'll all agree that Sumo Logic is a tremendously valuable analytics tool, and that's true at Xero, it's true for thousands of other companies. But sometimes the balance, you can end up questioning the balance between like the volume of log that you have and the value that you're getting from the analytics of it. And that's kind of the challenge that we've had at Xero because we're a very fast growing company. So I guess that's what I'm going to talk about today is how we went through a process of identifying what logs are valuable to us and the strategies and automation that we put in place to get that under control. So first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about Xero. We are a cloud accounting provider originally, but now we're a small business platform. Our mission is to rewire the world of small business, making it seamless, simpler, and smarter. We're a very fast-growing company. We are approaching 2 million paying subscribers. We have about a 30% plus growth rate annually in terms of our revenue, and we have an ecosystem of over 700 connected partner applications. So we really are growing into be an increasingly large company, and that's why for us log growth has always been quite a challenge because of the really fast rate of growth that we've had to deal with. So our log volume challenge in 2018 was that the company had been around for a long time, about 10 years, and we were getting to a point where we were trying as a business to become a cash positive and eventually a profitable company. Which is, probably everywhere you all get there at some point. So we were still a very fast-growing company. Our revenue was, in excess of 30% growth for the previous 2 financial years. But the problem that we had was that our log growth was over 100% per year. So in our business unit, we had a goal to reduce the platform cost to serve per subscriber. And in terms of log growth, it was actually going the other way by more than double, So we had 2 years of 100% log growth, and we couldn't really, we kind of had to do something to get this under control to contribute towards our business unit's goal. So the first thing we need to do was figure out what was the driver of log growth. For us, it was obviously more than just customers, because that number at the bottom is a lot bigger than the number at the top, right? So it's not just customer growth. And so we looked into it. Some of the things we came up with, the first one was that as we had scaled, some of the things we'd done with logs had become very, very expensive. So in the early stages of the company, we did a lot of log-based metric extraction where we'd get metrics from logs. We built custom APM solutions from logs. But as the company had scaled into millions of customers, hundreds of millions of requests per day, some of these things had just suddenly become really, really expensive. We were building a lot of microservices. And these usually had structured logging formats. So there's pretty much 2 ways that your microservices make your logging more expensive than our legacy apps had done. On the one hand, I have one big service with one entry point that I log. Say I turn that into 5 microservices and I have 5 entry points that I log. I've now got 5 times as much log. So that's one half of it. The other half of it is that our new structured logging formats in JSON format were often like 4 to 5 times the size per request that our legacy logs like Nginx, IIS, Apache had been. In terms of churn, that's the thing. Once you're doing infrastructure as code, containers, serverless apps, the constant churn that these things have generates a lot more machine data than our traditional auto-scaling groups, or even before that, our pet servers had done. And finally, we found that we had a lot of teams who just had bad logging practices. They logged too much, they logged spurious errors in enormous numbers, and they often left, say, things like debug log turned on in production because it had been useful when they'd been developing their app. So in terms of how we were going to solve the problem, we needed a strategy to do this. The thing for your strategy, if you have a problem similar to ours, is that you need to start from the values of your organization. In our organization, that means that we have a very open culture. We have autonomous development teams. They expect to have a lot of power to be autonomous and do the things that they want to do. And our role is really as a coach and an influencer in the SRE team is to challenge them to do better, but we have to own the problem ourselves and influence them to improve their practices. In terms of the value of our log, I came up with this chart here, which is how I envisaged the value that we were getting from logs and how we needed to move forward and what we needed to focus on. So the highest value area for us was that kind of intersection of the things that we searched a lot and the things that were part of actionable insights. And that was where we needed to focus on when we were looking at what we could include and exclude out of our logging estate. We had a lot of things in there that had an audit requirement though, and those are a lot of our logs, and we can't really do anything about that. We just have to log it until we come up with a better way of doing audit for those services. So the strategies that we came up with were, we were going to be a lot more selective about what we put into Sumo Logic. We were going to create a logging policy so that we had a foundation with which we could challenge our developers and the type of logging that they were doing. We needed to be using our observability tools better. So that meant moving some of our log solutions to metrics and making more use of some of the tracing tools that we now had available to us as a much bigger company. And finally, we wanted our logging environment to be more dynamic. We had some infrastructure as code pipelines that configured Sumo Logic collectors, but they were very, very rigid and very difficult to change. So our developers tended to turn everything on, and then it was difficult to ramp it back or change it once the things had been deployed. The next stage beyond the strategy stage is the actions that we were going to take to fix the problem. So these are more like 6 to 12 month timeframe actions to fix the business problem of log growth. We already had some automated detection in Sumo of who was creating the big logs that were kind of ruining it for everyone. But we kind of doubled down on that. We fine-tuned them, we wrote them better, and we created much more detailed runbooks and a response process for our team to follow up and have the challenge conversations that we needed to have with our developers when we had logging problems. To solve the problem of things that were high in volume but low in value, based on my diagram that I had up there before, we had to do more ingest filtering. So that meant that we removed some types of events. Some of our logs, we cut them down drastically. For example, we had one solution that we cut it down 95% in size by putting in some rules that just selectively took out a few things that we knew were important. And some of our things that were metrics and logs type solutions, we had to put in place some steps to convince people to move those to alternative tools that were metrics based or tracing tools instead. And finally, to deal with the challenge of poor logging practices, we needed to create a policy with some standards in it so that we had some lever that we could use to challenge people who weren't following what we considered to be best practice. And finally, the issue of log blowouts, which was becoming increasing. We have a secret trophy thing we have at Xero, the people who had the largest log blowouts of all time in the history of our company. But I won't mention the numbers, but what we were finding is, especially in the development and test environments, the number that people were clocking up was getting bigger and bigger, and it was happening more and more often. And we were finding that sometimes 10 or 20% of our log budget was consumed with spurious logging from accidents of very low value. So we created a system called Drunk Tank to do that, which I'll talk about in detail in a minute. So this is a slide, comes from Sumo. It's an error count of the number of errors from one of our biggest legacy apps that had been around for a long time at Xero. And you can see that there's a pretty drastic change there, right? A 99% reduction in the number of errors that this app was logging. That came about because we looked at our log policy, we started to look around and find things that didn't match the policy. And this one that had a very large number of errors that were not actionable was one of the things that we thought, well, this just doesn't match. So we approached the development team, we challenged them to do better, expecting that they would just give us a rubber stamp to filter out the 3 errors in Sumo that accounted for almost all of that graph. As it happened, they kind of went away, they did some research, they raised a whole bunch of JIRAs in different people's queues, and they implemented that fix you can see there, which dropped the error rate on the app by 99%. So you can see there that sometimes bad logging, if you improve the logging, you can actually improve the engineering practices in your company as well. So it's like a double win. And for us, that was almost like a beacon If that team could fix it, then no other team at Xero could say that they couldn't fix it. This is our Xero logging standard. You can see that that's from our Confluence page, which defines the standard. The standard actually deals with several different areas. There's like a formatting area, which is to do with, are your timestamps correct? Is your multi-line versus single-line configuration correct? Is your JSON passable in Sumo if it's in JSON format? But the biggest, most significant area is this content and usage area. So here we are focusing on what we regard, and not, I mean, if you've really looked on the internet, you know that most of this is not revelation, right? Like what you have here is not really that outrageous or different. We really just kind of tweaked a little bit to say, okay, we want to focus on what's actionable out of the logs, because that's where the biggest value is for us. And we want to have something here that we can crack down on the practices that we consider to be pretty poor, like debug logging in production is just one example there. And this is the interesting thing about this whole talk, is that this actually turned out, I thought it was just going to be a piece of paper, or virtual paper, but creating this in our company actually had a massive impact. Like, to some degree, a bigger impact that we can't even really measure, because it changed a lot of teams' behaviors just because it existed. On the right-hand side there, you can see that we also created like a logging quality checklist tool, so that any team could go in themselves and they could self-assess themselves against our kind of 5-star logging standard. And each of those points in there, once they've rated themselves, it has like some help information they can drill down to if they want to find out how to kind of meet that criteria. And to get 5 stars, they'd have to basically have what we would consider like every box ticked. And most of our logs wouldn't actually make it to 5 stars, but it's a really useful tool that we can use as services go into production to facilitate better logging, and also the other way around to allow people to do that themselves. The last thing I'm going to talk about in detail is our drunk tank, we call it. This is an automated system that we created at Xero. We have a lot of individual teams' development environments. We have hundreds and hundreds of instances. They're ephemeral. But with the new ingest budgets API, we thought, wow, we can finally get a lid on this. But we wanted it to operate as a quota, not a budget. So what we did is we created a set of 2 lambdas, one that uses the search job API and the ingest budgets API, that it basically finds out for us which non-production collectors have generated too much data, and then we automatically create a budget for them just for that one collector in Sumo, and you can see there's one there with 100%. Then we have a second lambda that goes through each day at 9 a.m. in our business time zone and takes away all the budgets from the previous day. So the business benefit for this for us is it meant that if we have teams in non-production environments creating logging problems, the problem is contained purely to them, and we don't have to do anything about it, and we basically put an absolute cap on the amount of quota that we can lose from these non-production problems. And we even have a Sumo dashboard for it, of course, right? Which you can see there. We have like some things we want to do in the future, which I don't really have time to talk about today, but I'd really love if any of you want to talk about it afterwards. These are all things that we would be looking to do kind of further on down the future as the next step as we scale to an even larger level of logging at Xero. So did we succeed? Well, yes we did. Before we had 5 to 10% log growth per month and 100% annually for 2 years. In this year so far, we had 7 months where we didn't need to uplift our license at all, and we were able to accommodate customer growth and even converting a company that we'd acquired from Elk to Sumo without having to increase our budget at all. So we pretty much achieved a much better volume of value. We don't have room in our license because we filled up the space that we created with valuable stuff, because that's the point of it, right? And even better, we were able as a business unit to be one of the teams that had made a strong contribution to reducing the cost to serve for the platform part of our business, which is, was the goal that we'd really set for ourselves in this whole process. Now, for the last part of my talk, I've been talking a little bit about more the cost side of things, but really you've got to think about the value side as well. Now, for me, I'm a numbers guy. I can see from these details here, we have 700 users in a month. We ran nearly over 1 million searches in Sumo. Some people hit hundreds of trillions of events that they scanned. So that's obviously a lot of value there. But if we needed another way to put some value on this, and that's where Pratik from Sumo is going to talk about Sumo Logic's business value framework.
Thank you, Rick. Can you guys hear me? Up? Can we increase the volume? Is it better now? Better? No? How about now? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Rick. I really enjoyed the way you told us your story about the problem you were facing, the growth, the exponential growth in log volume, and the business impact that it was having, right? Which was your costs were spiraling out of control, and the value was not justified with that growth in cost, which is the business problem that if you want to think about it, right, at the end of the day, it has a business impact. And the challenge is, how do you articulate the business impact, and how do you think about the value that Sumo Logic is adding to your organization? So Rick obviously went through this exercise and got their log volumes under control in an amazing way, which is best practice in our opinion. And we highly encourage you to talk to Rick about the technical aspects of that solution. But at the same time, in parallel, what Sumo Logic did is we partnered and collaborated with Rick and his team to build out a business case, a business justification for the Sumo Logic deployment at Xero, which not just talked about the volume of logs, but went into in-depth what is the use case behind this process and what is the impact that this is having at Xero's bottom line. And for that, we leveraged the Sumo Logic business value framework, which is shown on the slide. And what you have here on the left is the solutions from a Sumo Logic platform standpoint. And Xero uses it heavily in the operations analytics space, but several of our customers also look at it from security analytics and business intelligence and analytics, and a combination. So depending on how each customer deploys Sumo Logic as a platform, the value drivers to the right, they come to life. And we customize this framework, and we can work with individual customers and build this out. And we did exactly that with Xero and Rick's team. So we went in, we spoke with Rick's team about how Sumo Logic is deployed, what are the use cases for Sumo Logic, and which value drivers resonate and make sense, and build financial models around this to help Rick and his team talk to senior leaders within Xero and help them understand that yes, our costs have now come under control, but now let me tell you what is the value that we get by spending this much with Sumo Logic, right? So we are going a step beyond just controlling cost. And here is a summary of some of the use cases that we identified jointly in a collaborative manner with Rick and his team. So Sumo Logic is helping Xero at a high level with compliance automation, with security automation, lowering the need for manual labor in these areas. And at the same time, it's improving the security posture of Xero as a company, which therefore reduces the financial risk of a security breach from impacting Xero as an organization. And finally, there are some customer support use cases which end up reducing the need for dev labor to engage, because the customer success team is able to handle those things by leveraging Sumo Logic as a platform and looking at data and visualizing in Sumo Logic. So these are some great use cases that we uncovered, and then we quantified the business impact that this was having at Xero. And if you look at it, we've anonymized the data, so we don't want to share with you hard numbers, but the bar on the left, the investment bar, that shows you the cost of Sumo Logic at Xero. And in a joint collaboration, we quantified the benefits from these use cases, and you can see that these benefits are way more than the investment that is being made. So from a return on investment standpoint, this makes complete sense, right? So Xero has a great story to tell their leaders that, look, our log aggregation and analytics, we have improved our processes, we have best practices in place, we have a standard for logging in place, and that is limiting our growth, and we are now doing value-added logging, and we don't do unnecessary logging. And on top of that, let us tell you the story behind why this is important for Xero. These are the use cases, and these are the benefits that it's driving from a business impact standpoint to the bottom line of Xero, right? And the other cool thing is that if you go through an exercise like this, then you uncover some things that you didn't even know about your company. So I have a quote here from Rick himself. that when we went through this exercise, there were some use cases that we uncovered talking to different people within Xero that Rick wasn't even aware that Sumo Logic is being leveraged in this way. So how crazy is that? And we're finding areas where Sumo Logic is being deployed, and it's learning, it's leading to learning within the company that, my gosh, there are teams within Xero that are finding some great innovative uses to deploy Sumo and gain a lot of value for the company. So this is what we wanted to highlight here, and just an offer that we can partner with you in a similar way and talk about business value realization in your organizations as well. So with that, we are happy to take your questions.
Don't be shy.
We have a couple of minutes to answer maybe one or two questions.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the compliance in terms of teams deciding like, okay, we're standardizing on the definition of what an error message should be versus a warning versus info? Like what's kind of been the process of teams trying to comply with that new standard?
Yeah, so the question is I guess you're kind of saying, how do you know an error is an error, right? Yeah, I suppose that's why in our standard we chose a little bit to focus on words like actionable errors, which is kind of taking from the Google SRE sort of philosophy about actionable alerts and not having unnecessary noise. There's still a lot of diversity in the Xero landscape, because we are a big diverse company, but it's been really good to have that as a reference point, because each time we have a challenge conversation with a team that has a logging problem or a standard, something that's outside of what we consider the standard, we've immediately got something black and white to say, this is not an error if it doesn't have any impact on anything and no one ever needs to do anything. It should be a warning, right? This is not an info level event if you have 5 of them for every single time you call a function, it should be verbose or it should be trace, or debug. So that I guess is it's always still going to be a conversation and there's never going to be an absolute, but if you've got that's why the logging policy has been so valuable, because it's given us kind of like a stick in the sand, a reference point, to base those conversations from. And a lot of teams have come to us and said, is there a logging standard? I'm building a new app, and I can just say yes, and then it's there in black and white right from the beginning what the expectations are of what we consider to be good logging versus bad logging.
Anybody? Oh, one more.
Can you share that checklist anywhere? Can you open source that?
Yeah, if you give me your details, I'm sure I can share it with you. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to make it public, but yeah, I can. And I think the slides will be publicized at some point. I think they're videoing it, so it is kind of public. Yeah, but I can give it to you, sure.
I was just wondering, how do you balance between being able to have access to logs in order to help customers if they encounter API issues or things like that, and the balancing cost aspect? Because I know at my organization, we're logging every single GraphQL request, and we've seen how expensive that can be. And so I'm just wondering, is there a philosophical or...
I think the best answer I have to that is, how I was talking about looking forward, we're trying to make it more dynamic. So if we're able to make our logging configuration more dynamic, we can say to people, you're only allowed to ship your pipeline with errors turned on. If you have a real problem, here's an API call that you can make that will turn it back on to full, So, but the problem we had is some of our first CI/CD pipelines we built when we went into AWS were just too inflexible. So you had to redeploy the entire stack, the infrastructure, the ELBs, the whole thing, just to change one line of Sumo config, right? So that's kind of the key. If you can make it a little bit more dynamic, then you can be more prescriptive and say, no, you don't need everything, because we can make it everything when you need everything. Or the other approach is you can try to take stuff out of the messages. We did that with some of our JSON payloads. We used ingest rules to knock maybe 30% of the keys out. So it's still valid JSON, but we just replaced them with spaces. And that it didn't completely alleviate the problem, but it got rid of some of it. Similarly, if you have JSON with really long key names, you can just use an ingest rule to shorten the keys to be a unique string, so that then you can kind of encode it again on the other side in Sumo. That's kind of another way you can minimize the impact, I guess, of those types of logs.
All right. So that concludes this session. Thank you, Rick.
I'll hang around after if anyone's got more
Yeah.
questions.
Anybody
Thank
has
you.